Good afternoon. Today marks the beginning of Christian Aid Week. Christian Aid has long encouraged the Church to find sources of hope so that we might be inspired to take action on the causes and consequences of climate change. But we find it hard to change our ways, doubly so since the issues are not just personal, they are also national and global. And while the West, living in relative wealth, have struggled, imagine what it is like for some of the poorest countries in our world. No wonder Christian Aid called climate change to be the focus in 2020. And then, of course, along came COVID-19. And if the Western world struggles to contain this maverick virus, just imagine how it is for some of the world's poorest countries. But first, a step back to 2019. A short video clip which sets the scene, if you like, for today. We looked at this, and two young activists separated by 18 years, Severn Suzuki, speaking at the Earth Summit in 1992, and then Greta Thunberg a few months ago. Their message speaks for itself, their challenge is strong and clear. This sent me back to one of the Old Testament prophets and to listen again to his words. We find this in Micah chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. Through Micah, God challenges Israel and then clearly states God's requirements. This is what he says. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. We may well wonder if someone writing millennia before the manufacture of disposable plastic and industrial pollutants has anything to contribute as a source of hope and inspiration of action on the climate crisis. This morning, of necessity, I keep it simple. First, Micah names the powers, much like today's activists. All people, the earth and all that is in it, this is a global message. Micah names and shames the corruption of the political leaders, the dishonesty of the merchants and greed of those who control the use of land. He denounces their exploitation and oppression of people and land. He condemns the misplaced worship and devotion to greed that religious leaders of his day have allowed to happen on their watch. Theologians show us that such naming of the systemic powers of injustice, along with a deliberate engagement with them, is a necessary step towards establishing a vision of shalom, God's peace, God's shalom. We will recognise that, as in Micah's time, so too climate injustice feeds upon power and self-interest, fuelled by the myth of perpetual growth. These are false gods which continue to entice the world away from a biblical vision of peace and justice and the well-being of all. If we are to imagine this better world, then we need to begin with naming and engaging of these systemic powers that have led to the injustices that now mar creation and threaten its very existence. We do this not necessarily to make scapegoats of specific people, companies or practices, but to engage with them in imaginative and creative ways. The prophets of old were good at this. They found ways to make the injustices clear and unacceptable. We may not approve of Extinction Rebellion, but it certainly captured our attention. Micah warned of trouble ahead. We too have been warned and are beginning to see some of the outcomes from our behaviour. Plastic in the sea, air pollution, earthquakes, typhoons, destroyed coral reefs, melting ice. And yet again, these outcomes are affecting the poorest and the least able to cope. The evidence is clear, yet do we see? Do we hear? And while we might look to our own resources and solutions in response, God presents us with a more radical challenge in those familiar words of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. What does God require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? How might this work? Do justice. God requires us to do justice with those who are worst affected yet least responsible for the climate crisis, to amplify and join with their voices in the call for a new deal for climate justice. Sign the petition on the Christian Aid website. To do justice also requires justice for the earth, to acknowledge that the raging fires, the flooding rivers, the devastating typhoons and species extinction are a result of the grave injustice of exploitation and neglect of the natural rhythms we must now learn to live in harmony with. Think David Attenborough. Love kindness. God requires us to embody, to live, loving mercy and kindness. And in so doing, believe in the hope that perhaps even the most ardent climate change denying politician or the most active carbon emitting company has the potential to change. And to accept that even as individuals, we can't always do the right thing, but we can all be aware and informed, and we can do our best. Walk humbly. Walking humbly means turning to God in prayer, in continuous and collective prayer for the planet. And I believe that such prayer will also change us and our behaviours. Why not join the Christian Aid prayer chain, joining with brothers and sisters across the world, reminding ourselves that the earth is the Lord's, and in setting our hearts to seek God, we gain in courage to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly. And above all, to remember that change is always possible. Do not limit God, nor the power of prayer. Thanks be to God. Keep safe, everyone. See you soon. Take care. God bless.